Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. In case you're new here, what you're about to hear is part 40 in an ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. Each episode in this series is designed so that newcomers can listen to it and get something out of it without needing to go back and listen to all the previous episodes. It is, of course, still part of a series, and if you feel like you're missing some of the context, that context can usually be found in prior episodes of the series. Last time, I covered the revolution of 1989 in East Germany and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Today, I will cover the events of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. It's been a while since I talked about Czechoslovakia on this podcast, so for those of you who feel like you might need a refresher on prior events in that country, the events of the 1968 Prague Spring, which I covered back in episode 22, are highly relevant to the events I will cover today. This is The End of History, Part 40. Time is a funny thing. When we look back at different historical eras, particularly in more recent history, it's sometimes tempting to wall eras off as being isolated from one another, something that is easier to do when they're time periods you didn't actually live through. When I think about the 1960s, I typically think of flower power, Woodstock, the Beatles, and the Cultural Revolution in general. When I think of the 1980s, I think of big hair, glam rock, and Reaganomics. At first glance, these are two very different decades, isolated from one another by very different cultural phenomena. Especially because I didn't live through either decade, excepting a short 6-month period in 1989, it's easy for me to look at these two decades and separate them in my mind into two distinct epochs inhabited by entirely different people. But of course, many of the same people were involved in important events in both decades. Ronald Reagan, for instance, who was President of the United States for most of the 1980s and is a highly representative figure from that decade, did not actually emerge from the ether in 1980 to claim the Republican nomination for president. He served as governor of California beginning in 1967 and was an influential political figure in the late 1960s. The Prague Spring, the reforms that took place in Czechoslovakia in 1968, alternatively known as the Program of Socialism with a Human Face, which was crushed by an invasion of the country by the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc states in August 1968, was separated from the revolutions of 1989 by 21 years. For context, that's the difference between today and events in 2004. Maybe I'm just old at this point, but to me, 2004 is pretty recent history. I was 15 years old, and though my worldview was not fully formed, I had real, sincerely held political opinions, and a pretty decent understanding of the world. Many of the people who are today instrumental figures in the world were already making their mark on the world in 2004. Donald Trump's reality television program The Apprentice premiered in 2004. His recent electoral rival, Kamala Harris, took office as the San Francisco District Attorney in 2004. And Vladimir Putin entered his 5th year as president of the Russian Federation in 2004. My point is, 2004 just wasn't that long ago, and it's not surprising that many of the people who are in positions of power and influence today were also in positions of power and influence then. After the Prague Spring was crushed by the Soviets and their allies in August 1968, the new hardline communist regime in Czechoslovakia embarked upon a program of what they called normalization. Normalization basically meant a systemic undoing of the humanist reforms that had taken place during the Prague Spring. The man who replaced Alexander Dubček as first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia in 1969, Gustav Hušák, was more of a pragmatic coward than a hardline Stalinist ideologue. He had at first been an ally of Dubček and supported his reforms, only turning against them when it became clear that the Soviet Union's leadership intended to stop them. He was a safe choice for Brezhnev to prop up and keep the Czechoslovak party in line with Moscow's directives. He was, after all, similar to Brezhnev in his pragmatic outlook that eschewed ideology in favor of preserving the status quo. He could be trusted by Brezhnev to follow Soviet direction and stifle dissent, while also not going too far in the persecution of his own people and thereby inflaming the unrest that had only so recently been quelled. Thus, under Hushak, though reforms were rolled back and dissent was not tolerated, there would be no return to the brutal Stalinist purges of the 1950s. Thus, the people who had participated in the Prague Spring did not disappear from society. Many had diminished positions and faded into the background, but they were still there, living their lives. A number of Czechoslovakians remember the period of normalization for what was essentially a new social contract between the people and their government. If they refrained from talking about 1968 and at least pretended to believe in Marxism-Leninism, which was espoused by the state as its official ideology, they would mostly be left alone. One Czech doctor later summed up the political environment in this period, quote, "You had to learn avoidance. In fact, what would be the point in trying to stand up to the regime all by yourself? You would just hurt yourself and your family. So you tried not to get involved in public life, keep away from activism of any kind, and if they forced you, you tried to wiggle out of it. And avoidance was possible. Sometimes with a bit of trouble, like my husband, he was never promoted to an executive position because he refused to join the party, but it was not so terrible you couldn't survive. So we just lived. Being inconspicuous was a big advantage. You could easily survive." End quote. A BBC journalist who reported on the Velvet Revolution from Prague, Alan Little, later recalled a conversation with a university professor who taught Marxism courses that were required for the students in all departments. He asked her if she even believed in the ideology she was tasked with teaching, and her reply was that those who had lived through the events of 1968 knew better than to even ask that question. There were, of course, true believers and hardline communists among the population, especially among the urban factory workers. But the larger portion of the population was simply going through the motions. Life was just easier if you went along and acted as if you believed in the party line. So that is what most people did. But by the 1980s, dissatisfaction with the status quo was growing. People could see that the socialist system was no longer working. The people had traded their liberty for security, but the state was no longer able to provide that security. The issues faced by the people in Czechoslovakia in the 1980s should be familiar to anyone who has been listening to my podcast for a while. They were the same kind of mainly economic issues faced by people in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and the Soviet Union itself. A slogan voiced by an anti-regime demonstrator in 1989 perhaps best summed up the ills of late socialist society, when he referred to the 7 wonders of Czechoslovakia. Quote, "Everybody has a job. Although everybody has a job, nobody works. Although nobody works, the plan is fulfilled up to 105%. Although the plan is fulfilled up to 105%, there's nothing in the shops. Although there's nothing in the shops, we've got enough of everything. Although we've got enough of everything, everybody steals. Although everybody steals, nothing ever goes missing anywhere. And the 8th wonder of the world is that it has been working for 41 years. End quote. In 1987, Hushak, who had been in power ever since 1968, was ousted from his leadership of the party, though he would retain his symbolic role as president. And he was replaced with Milos Jakeš, a younger man who said he was in favor of perestroika and wanted to enact similar reforms in Czechoslovakia. The promised reforms, however, were slow in coming, and often half-hearted at best. The regime, still, even after the change in leadership, stubbornly clung to the status quo. The memories of 1968 had never gone away, but were merely officially silenced and left bubbling just beneath the surface. They rose to the surface again in the late 80s as people faced mounting economic hardship. It was not the generation of 1968 that would spark the revolution of 1989, but a new generation. University students who had not yet been born or who had been small children during the Prague Spring. Nonetheless, the memory of '68 had been kept alive among Czechoslovakia's youth, and you would have been hard-pressed to find a young person in 1989 who could not tell you about Alexander Dubček and the events of 1968. The memory was kept alive in the shadows, passed on to the younger generation by their parents outside official channels, in spite of the official silence. This younger generation, like their contemporaries in East Germany, also had access to Western broadcasts on TV, which, although unlike in the case of Germany, the broadcasts were generally not in their own language, they nonetheless had a cultural impact, especially on more educated multilingual youth. Young people were enamored with Western music and fashion, and also desired the civil and political freedoms that were available in the West, and the memory of which had not been extinguished in their own country. Yet, even after perestroika began in the USSR and many of the Eastern Bloc states followed suit and initiated reforms, the regime in Czechoslovakia stubbornly resisted this kind of change, stubbornly clinging to an older, hardline version of communism. And so the pressure to change by 1987 was coming not just from the West, but from Czechoslovakia's own Eastern Bloc allies, including the Soviet Union, and from dissenting voices within the ruling Communist Party itself. At the top, the leaders endeavored to keep these so-called reform communists outside the party's leadership circle, but they could not prevent the ideas of Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost from seeping into the rank and file of the party. This was true in two arms of the party in particular. One, which I will address later, was the security service, and the other, which I will talk about now, was the party youth organization, the Socialist Union of Youth, or SUY. The SUY leadership was increasingly influenced by the unofficial groups of anti-communist students that had begun to spring up at universities around the country. They wanted to reform communism, not abolish it, but they were denied a voice to advocate this position within the Communist Party, and eventually turned to an alliance with the unofficial, non-party aligned student movement. This independent student union had coalesced in 1988 from unconnected underground predecessors across the country around a public demonstration to mark the 20th anniversary of the Soviet invasion to crush the Prague Spring on August 21st, 1988. Although the demonstration was small compared to what would come in 1989, it is estimated that around 10,000 people dared to publicly protest the communist regime. In the aftermath of the August 1988 demonstration, the government attempted to clamp down on these independent student groups. However, many of the leaders of the communist SUY were reform-minded, and though committed Marxists, they held freedom of expression as a universal value, and began to push the SUY to act in solidarity with their fellow young people. For example, at the Prague City University, the SUY was given access to advanced printing equipment so that they could publish their official party-aligned newspaper. But they secretly began to share this equipment with the independent student union at the university so that they could publish and distribute their newspaper, Youth Front. The use of this professional equipment allowed this anti-communist youth union to circulate their ideas to a significantly wider segment of the population. Though the circulation of this newspaper was illegal, the security services did little to enforce the ban. Though the regime had managed to prevent reform communists from infiltrating the Politburo, many had managed to become high-ranking officers in the state secret police, the STB. Thus, many of the command-level STB officers, including, according to some sources, the director of the STB, Alois Lorenz, were sympathetic to the efforts of the students, and did not therefore feel compelled to strictly enforce the prohibition of their newspaper. The reformers and anti-communist activists in Czechoslovakia watched with the rest of the world as communism was peacefully toppled, first in Poland, and then in Hungary, and finally they watched as the Berlin Wall, the very symbol of Eastern Bloc communism, was toppled in East Germany. See previous episodes for more on those revolutions. As each domino fell, it appeared more and more realistic that meaningful change was also possible in Czechoslovakia. Most accounts of the Velvet Revolution begin with the International Students' Day March in Prague on November 17, 1989, which was undoubtedly an important spark, But the demonstrations that would turn to revolution actually began one day earlier in Bratislava, now the capital of independent Slovakia, when university and high school students marched, demanding perestroika-style reforms. The march in Bratislava caught the local party officials off guard, and not knowing how to react, they allowed it to proceed without incident. The November 17th march in Prague did not catch the regime by surprise. In fact, they had approved it. It was organized by the Communist Youth Organization, the SUY, that I talked about before, to commemorate the International Students' Day, which falls on the anniversary of the 1939 death of Jan Upletal, a Czech student killed by the Nazis during their quelling of student protests against the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. The regime's legitimacy relied on its anti-fascist credentials, and Upletal and International Students' Day had long been officially celebrated by the communist regime. They simply would not have had a leg to stand on in denying the Communist Youth Union's request for permission to march. Leaders of the SUY gave assurances to the party higher-ups that the march would be peaceful and would stick to the approved route, which avoided the city center. And under these conditions, the regime granted students permission to hold their march. However, it was not just to be young communists who participated in this march. The independent student movement, and indeed dissidents of all stripes, would seize the opportunity to protest the regime. I've seen some wildly different estimates as to the size of the crowd that turned out for the march, ranging between 15 and 50,000. At 4 p.m., they marched from their gathering point to the Vyšehrad Cemetery, the final resting place of Jan Upletal, as well as numerous other Czech national heroes. As they marched, many in the crowd carried signs with slogans including "Democracy and Law," "Free Elections," and "We want to live in a normal way." Chants began to emerge from the marching crowd. At first, more moderate chants like "Perestroika here." Then, as time went on, the chants became increasingly radical, with chants of "Remember 68" and "Down with the Communists" ringing out. By around 6:30 p.m., the official march had ended, and the weather was very cold. A large contingent went home. But among those that remained, a few started to cry out to Wenceslas Square, calling for the march to continue to the city center without government permission. A few thousand of the demonstrators broke off and marched towards the city center. As the crowd reached the National Theatre on Narodny Street, which led to Prague's central Wenceslas Square, they found their way blocked by a line of police in riot gear with plastic shields. The police ordered them to disperse. The protesters sat down in the street. They sang hymns, including the American civil rights classic "We Shall Overcome." Some handed flowers to the police. They were completely peaceful, but they refused to move. The police then brought in reinforcements who came up behind the protesters, blocking all paths of escape. At this point, sensing what was coming, some of the protesters stood up and attempted to leave, pleading with the police to clear a path, but their pleas were refused. Around 9 p.m., the police attacked. They moved into the crowd and began beating protesters with batons. Dasa Antilova, a university student who was at the protest, remembered, quote, "There was blood everywhere, and I could hear bones cracking. They selected people from the first row of the demonstration, and they beat them mercilessly. They would not let the young people go. They brought in buses and they arrested them all." End quote. Even a British journalist, Edward Lucas, was mistaken for a protester and knocked unconscious by an STB officer with a baton. When it was over, 561 people were injured, and over 120 arrested. And one apparently lifeless body was covered in a blanket and carried out on a stretcher, witnessed by hundreds of protesters amidst the chaos. This is where the plot thickens somewhat. According to the results of a 1990 investigation, the supposedly lifeless body was actually that of a young STB officer who was undercover and had been placed inside the independent student movement with the task of monitoring their activities. His name was Ludwik Zivchak, and he was fine. He had been ordered to play dead by his superiors in the STB as part of a plot to create a public outcry with the goal of forcing Yakish and the other conservative party leaders out and replacing them with pro-perestroika reformers. I haven't been able to find a copy of the report of this investigation in English, and unfortunately I don't speak Czech or Slovak. So my knowledge relies entirely on secondary sources that are available in English. From those, it is unclear exactly how the plotters thought this would work. The whole thing appears to have been rather ill-considered. Ill-considered as it was, it appears that the STB were the ones who initiated the rumors that subsequently floated around the student movement and eventually into the foreign press that a student named Martin Smeed had been killed by police at the protests. The regime, of course, immediately denied the accusation and truthfully issued a public statement that nobody had been killed. But the whole thing was so bizarre that it looked like a ham-fisted attempt by the government to cover up Smeed's murder. To that extent, at least, the plotters' plan worked perfectly. The denials appeared to the public to be a confession. But what happened after that is probably not what the plotters intended, as the situation soon exploded beyond anyone's ability to control. The next day, November 18th, 1989, in response to the violence on Narodny Street, both the Communist Student Union and the non-communist student organizations and dissident groups came together in Prague to form a unified student front, calling for all university students in Prague to go on strike. Later that evening, actors and stage workers elected to strike in solidarity with the students. Instead of performing as scheduled that evening, stage actors appeared before their audiences and read a proclamation declaring solidarity with the striking students and calling for others to join the movement. They were, in many cases, met with standing ovations from their audiences. To some of my listeners, stage actors striking probably doesn't seem like a big deal. In the English-speaking world, at least in the United States, attending a play is not a common activity, and it's generally seen as an activity reserved for societal elites. But that's not the case in Czech culture. An evening at the theater is an integral activity to Czech culture, and it's enjoyed by rich and poor, educated and uneducated alike. Stage actors in Prague, therefore, were widely celebrated and wielded a lot of influence, probably more akin to that wielded by Hollywood screen actors in the West today. After the stage actors joined the strike, the theaters of Prague became the central staging ground for revolutionary activities as events unfolded. One theater in particular, the Magic Lantern, would become the unofficial headquarters of the unified opposition throughout the revolution. It was here, on November 19th, that the leaders from the diverse opposition organizations, including student organizations, human rights groups, and religious organizations, came together to form a united front, the Civic Forum. A sister coalition, the Slovak Public Against Violence, was simultaneously formed in the Slovak lands, where politics were always related but distinct and different from those in the Czech lands. The Civic Forum elected the prominent playwright and political dissident Václav Havel as its leader, for the first time creating a fully unified opposition operating under a unified leadership structure. Born in 1936, Václav Havel came from a prominent, elite political Czech family. After the communists took over in 1948, his bourgeois background worked against him, preventing him from attending the university programs in humanities that he so desired to attend, or from any number of other opportunities that were reserved for the children of the favored proletarian class. He first gained widespread recognition in the late 1950s, when he began circulating plays he had written through Samizdat self-publication around Prague's subversive underground theater scene. His plays were widely circulated by a population hungry for entertainment that was thoughtful, intelligent, and unencumbered by the Communist Party's censorship. He first became known as a political dissident during the 1968 Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia, when he was widely listened to as the voice of Radio Free Czechoslovakia, where he broadcast daily play-by-play updates on the course of the invasion and the crushing of the Prague Spring. He thereafter became one of Czechoslovakia's leading dissidents, known mostly for the anti-communist essays he published via Samizdat, most notably his 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless. He was frequently jailed and released by the authorities only to continue his political dissidence. Even considering all this, in 1989 he was still not a household name outside dissident circles in Czechoslovakia. He was actually probably better known in the West, where his essays and other writings were not censored or suppressed. It is rather telling of the direction the revolution was taking that Václav Havel was selected as the leader of the unified opposition, rather than a more moderate figure like the reform communist of 1968 fame, Alexander Dubček, who after all was still around and deeply involved in the unfolding revolution, first in his native Slovak lands and later in Prague. Early on, many still expected that Dubček may yet emerge as the natural leader of this new revolution and finish the work left undone in 1968. But it was not to be, and there was a rather interesting moment in the midst of the revolution that demonstrates why. When he first returned to Prague on November 20th, Alexander Dubček appeared on the stage at the Magic Lantern alongside Václav Havel to great cheers and fanfare. When he spoke, however, of reinvigorating socialism, he was met with much less enthusiasm, including some groans from the crowd. And Havel's anti-communist message was much more warmly received. Dubček was still a popular and important figure, but events had passed his ideology by. He could not be the leader of this revolution because, as radical as he was by the standards of 1968, he was too conservative for 1989. Quite simply, he was fully dedicated to free expression and human rights, but he was unable to shed his dedication to Marxism and the socialist economic model. And those views were no longer in line with a majority of the opposition. Indeed, though they had been instrumental in the early stage of the revolution, reform communists, including those from the Communist Youth Union, were pretty quickly sidelined in the movement as events passed them by. After electing Havel as their leader, the Civic Forum published a list of demands, which included the removal of all communist leaders who had played any role in crushing the Prague Spring, including both Hušák and Jákeš, the removal of all communist ministers who had ordered or been involved in the suppression of the November 17th student protest, the establishment of an independent inquiry into the events of November 17th, and the immediate release of all political prisoners. The following day, the Civic Forum added one additional demand that was to be completely transformative of the movement: the repeal of the provision of the Constitution that established the leading position of the Communist Party. It meant the end of the Communist Party's monopoly on power, which we have seen from Hungary, Poland, and East Germany effectively meant the end of communist government. The government replied with a formal statement denouncing the Civic Forum and refusing any concessions. Beginning on November 20th, Wenceslas Square in central Prague would be continuously occupied by demonstrators until the end of the revolution. The numbers would fluctuate depending on the weather and time of day. Most people did not camp out in the square but would come and go, with most coming after work hours. The number of people in the square on November 20th was estimated at around 300,000, and the number likely peaked on the evening of November 25th, when it is estimated that the square was filled with 800,000 people. That number is remarkable when you consider that the population of Prague in 1989 was just under 1.4 million, meaning well over half the city's population was gathered at one time in Wenceslas Square. This was no longer a movement of a few thousand radical students, but a national revolution involving millions. Similar occupations occurred in other cities around Czechoslovakia, with the largest after Prague being in Bratislava, where the crowd is estimated to have peaked at around 100,000, in a city of less than 500,000 people. I've been to Bratislava. It's not a very big city. You can pretty easily explore most of it in a day. So when I saw that there was a crowd of 100,000 people in Bratislava, I did a double take. It speaks to how popular this revolution was and how thoroughly the authorities had lost control. The growing revolution in the streets of cities all over the country threw the Communist Party into a tailspin. On November 22nd, Miloš Jákeš attempted to call out the People's Militia, a sort of part-time Communist Party army made up of factory workers who could serve in it to earn a little extra money. The authorities hoped that this militia, made up of proletarian workers, the party's traditional base of support, could be used to put down the demonstrations by force. It was thought that since the militia members also had to be party members, their loyalty could be relied on more so than that of the army. The problem was, many of the factory workers who served in the militia had kids or other family members who were involved in the protest movement, and they had no interest in violently suppressing their families, their friends, and their neighbors. The militias almost uniformly refused to muster. Later that evening, Defense Minister Milan Václavík issued a public statement that the army, quote, will not fight the people, end quote. And that was pretty much it for the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia. They did not have the support of the army, they did not have the support of the secret police, and they did not even have the support of their own partisan militia. There was no conceivable way to assert their authority by force. The American politician Aaron Burr, most famous for killing Alexander Hamilton of $10 Bill and Broadway musical fame, once supposedly defined the law as that which is boldly asserted and plausibly maintained. In this case, I would extend that same idea to the existence of a government. In order to govern, a government must be able to plausibly maintain itself, meaning there has to be some basis of legitimacy for its right to rule, be it the will of the people, the divine right of kings, or something else. But to be a true government, it must also be able to boldly assert itself, essentially boiling down to its ability to impose itself by force. Every government has both of these traits, whether it's a democracy, a dictatorship, or something in between. After November 22, 1989, the communist regime in Czechoslovakia had lost the ability to assert itself by force, and it became inevitable that they could not hold on as a government. They held on for one more day, hoping a solution would magically present itself. It didn't. On November 24th, the entire leadership of the Communist Party, including First Secretary Milos Jakeš, resigned. This didn't quite amount to the Communist Party surrendering power. They did elect new leadership and continued to assert their legitimacy. But the new leadership they elected were all pro-reform communists, determined to negotiate with the opposition, as had been done in Poland and Hungary. The new party first secretary, Karl Urbanek, assigned the communist prime minister, Ladislav Adamec, to enter negotiations with the Civic Forum. Historian Victor Sebastien described Adamec as, quote, a careerist first, a cynic second, and a communist third, end quote. Adamec entered the negotiations on November 26th, determined to preserve a continuing role, if not for the Communist Party, at least for himself in the future government. He failed. To copy a phrase recently used by Donald Trump, he didn't have the cards. He had almost no support from the people, no force behind him, and even lacked the support of much of his own party. In the end, the only thing to negotiate was the peaceful transfer of power. On November 28th, the Communists officially agreed to all of the Civic Forum's demands, including the formal abolition of the Communist Party's leading role and monopoly on power. An interim government made up mostly of leaders from the Civic Forum took over on December 7th. An election was held on December 29th, 1989, and Václav Havel became the first non-communist president of Czechoslovakia since 1948. A few days before the Velvet Revolution, the Communist Party of Bulgaria deposed Todor Zhivkov, who had ruled as the dictator of that country since 1954, and replaced him with a reformer who promised to open the government to multi-party elections. So by the beginning of December 1989, only one hardline communist ruler remained in the Eastern Bloc, Ceausescu of Romania, and his dramatic fall will be the subject of my next episode. That's everything for today. If you like what you heard, don't forget to give the show a 5-star rating on the podcast platform you're listening on. If you really like the show and you want to support my work in these times of economic uncertainty, you can sign up to donate monthly through the show's Patreon page at patreon.com/historyspherepodcast. A link is also available on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find links to my streaming platforms, social media, and a list of my sources for this episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. If you're listening on Spotify, you can drop a comment directly on the episode. Ask a question, correct a mistake, or just let me know what you thought of this episode. Engagement helps to promote the show in the algorithm and introduce it to new listeners, so it really does help me out. And finally, you can also provide support by just telling your friends about the show. However you choose to support the show, even if just by listening, I'm grateful for all of you. Next time on the History Sphere, I will discuss the fall of the Ceausescu regime in Romania. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.